You will never see the light of day again, George.
Please, Desmond, have mercy.
Mercy is a luxury you can no longer afford.
The candle nearly went out when George Whitmore's hand closed around Flora's wrist. She had only come to the study at Brindle House to deliver the ledgers, her arms full of paper, her mind on nothing but the ink still drying on the last page. George did not let go. He pulled her closer, his fingers pressing hard enough to bruise, and told her no one would believe a housemaid over the steward of the estate. Flora's breath caught. The ledgers slipped from her arms and scattered across the floor. She did not see the door open behind her. Desmond had returned from London early, his boots still dusty from the road, and the sight before him stopped him cold. His steward's hand on a trembling young woman, her wrist twisted at an angle no gentleman would allow. He crossed the room before either of them heard him move. His hand caught George's wrist the way George had caught hers, and he did not raise his voice when he spoke, which somehow made it worse. "Touch her again," Desmond said, "and you're dead." George's face went the color of old parchment. Flora stood frozen, one hand pressed to the marks already rising on her skin, staring at the Duke as though she had never truly seen him before. No one at Brindle House had ever heard the Duke threaten a man's life. No one had ever seen him look at a servant the way he looked at her now. What happened between the Duke and the housemaid in the weeks that followed would change both their lives forever, and neither of them saw it coming. If you were watching, tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. Like this video if you want to see what Desmond does next, and subscribe so you don't miss a single part. The morning after Desmond's warning, Brindle House woke to a silence that had never sat in its halls before. Flora rose before dawn, as she always did, though her wrist still ached beneath her sleeve. She wrapped a strip of linen around it before anyone could see, tucking the evidence away the same way she tucked away everything that frightened her. She had worked at Brindle House since she was 16, first in the sculleries, then in the linen rooms, and finally as the young woman trusted to carry the household ledgers between the housekeeper and the steward's office. She was 23 now, quiet by habit, careful by necessity, and until the night before, she had believed herself invisible to the man who owned the very floors she scrubbed. She had been wrong. Sylvie found her in the kitchen passage, pressing cold water to her wrist when she thought no one was looking. "You are not fooling anyone," Sylvie said, setting down her basket of eggs. She had worked beside Flora for 4 years and knew the shape of her silences better than most. The whole kitchen heard him shout. "George never shouts." "He did not shout," Flora said. "He simply did not let go." Sylvie's face changed. She glanced toward the passage that led to the study, then back at Flora's wrist, and her voice dropped low. "And the Duke?" Flora did not answer at once. She could still feel the heat of that room, the way Desmond's voice had gone quiet instead of loud, the way that quiet had frightened George more than any shout could have. She had spent 5 years learning to disappear into corners whenever the Duke passed through a room. Now she could not stop seeing his face, the fury banked behind his eyes, the careful way he had checked her wrist before he had even looked at George again. "He told George to leave the room," she said finally. "And George left." Sylvie's eyebrows rose. Nobody left a room at the Duke's command unless they valued their position above their pride, and George Whitmore valued little beyond himself. By mid-morning, the story had traveled through Brindle House the way stories always did, growing teeth and claws as it passed from the sculleries to the stables. Una, who managed the linen stores and had buried 2 husbands before the age of 30, cornered Flora near the drying yard with her arms crossed and her eyes sharp. "They are saying His Grace nearly broke Whitmore's arm," Una said. "He did not break anything," Flora said. though her voice wavered on the word anything. Pity, Una said, and went back to her sheets. Flora tried to lose herself in her work, but the ledgers would not balance themselves, and her mind kept drifting back to the study, to the low, even sound of Desmond's voice. Touch her again and you're dead. She had heard threats before, empty ones flung about by drunken footmen and impatient tradesmen. But she had never heard a man mean anything the way Desmond had meant those 5 words. She did not see him again until evening, when she was summoned to the study for the second time in 2 days. Her stomach turned as she climbed the stairs. She half expected to find George waiting there again. Some cruel trick meant to test whether the Duke's warning had teeth. Instead she found Desmond alone, standing at the window with his back to the door, his coat discarded over the chair, his shirt still creased from the ride he had taken that afternoon to inspect the eastern fields. "You sent for me, Your Grace," Flora said, her voice steadier than she felt. He turned. For a moment he only looked at her, and the look unsettled her more than anger would have. There was no command in his eyes, no distance. Only something quieter, something she did not have a name for. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I would rather stand, Your Grace. I am not asking as your employer." His jaw tightened. "I am asking as a man who watched another man twist your arm hard enough to bruise it, and who would like to know whether it has happened before." Flora's throat went dry. She had not expected the question, and she certainly had not expected the weight behind it, as though the answer mattered to him beyond the ordinary concerns of a household master keeping order among his staff. "No, Your Grace," she said. It was not entirely true. George had cornered her before, in smaller ways, a hand on her shoulder that lingered too long, a comment about her appearance that made her skin crawl. She had said nothing, because saying something had never once helped a housemaid against a steward, not anywhere she had worked. Desmond studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression told her he did not believe the denial. "George Whitmore has served this house for 11 years, he said. "My father trusted him. I inherited that trust without questioning it, which I now see was a mistake." He crossed to his desk and rested both hands against it, leaning forward. "I want you to tell me the truth, Flora. Has he done this before?" Hearing her name in his mouth startled her more than the question itself. In 5 years he had never once used it. She had been the housemaid, the young woman with the ledgers, a shape moving through the edges of his household. Never Flora. "There were smaller things," she admitted quietly. "I did not think they mattered enough to trouble Your Grace." "They mattered." His voice had an edge to it now, sharp and low. "They will always matter. Do you understand me?" She nodded, though her chest felt tight and strange, unfamiliar warmth pressing against old, practiced fear. He straightened, drawing back the distance between them as though he had suddenly remembered himself. "I have written to Dove Bridge this afternoon. My aunt requires a steward for her household, and Whitmore has enough experience to satisfy her requirements. He will be gone from Brindle House within the week." Relief washed through Flora so fast it nearly buckled her knees. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Do not thank me." His eyes met hers again, steady and dark. "A man under my roof laid hands on someone in my care. I did only what any decent man would have done." She wanted to tell him that decency was rarer than he seemed to believe, that she had worked in houses where far worse had gone unpunished, where masters had looked away rather than lose a convenient steward. But she said nothing, because saying such things aloud felt like inviting a danger she could not yet name. She curtsied and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "Flora." She turned back. "If he or anyone else in this house ever raises a hand to you again," Desmond said, I want you to come to me directly, not to the housekeeper, not to Sylvie or Una, to me. Her heart beat strangely at the request, at the low certainty in his voice, and she found herself nodding before she had decided to agree. That night, lying awake in the narrow bed she shared with no one, Flora turned the day over in her mind again and again, searching for a version of events that made sense of what she had witnessed. Dukes did not concern themselves with the bruises of housemaids. Dukes did not use their names, or ask after old wounds, or promise protection with such quiet, absolute conviction. She told herself it meant nothing, that any decent master would have done the same. But some small, unguarded part of her, a part she had spent years keeping locked away, wondered if she had just glimpsed something Brindle House had never shown her before. She did not yet know that George Whitmore would not leave quietly, that his pride would curdle into something far more dangerous than a bruised wrist, or that the true threat to her safety had not yet stepped out of the shadows. She only knew that for the first time in 5 years, she had looked at the Duke of her own household and seen a man, not a master, and that the sight of him had left something in her chest she could not name and did not know how to silence. George Whitmore did not sleep the night his dismissal was announced. He sat in the small office off the servants' hall long after the candles in the main house had been extinguished, staring at the letter Desmond's clerk had delivered to him that afternoon. Steward's position at Dove Bridge. A demotion dressed up as an opportunity, sent to the household of the Duke's aunt, a woman known throughout the county for her exacting standards and her complete lack of patience for men who could not control their tempers. He read the letter 3 times before he folded it and set it aside. 11 years he had given to Brindle House. 11 years of managing accounts, negotiating with tenants, keeping the estate running smoothly enough that the old Duke, and later his son, never had cause to think twice about the man beneath them. And it had all unraveled because of a housemaid who could not keep her wrist out of his hand and a master who had walked in at precisely the wrong moment. He told himself it was not his fault. He told himself Flora had provoked something in him he could not entirely name, some frustration that had built for months as he watched her move through the house with her quiet composure, never flinching, never softening toward him the way other maids eventually did when a man in his position showed interest. He told himself many things that night, and none of them made the fury in his chest any smaller. By morning, he had decided he would not leave without taking something with him. He found his opportunity 3 days later, when Desmond rode out to inspect a flooded tenant farm on the eastern boundary of the estate, taking his steward's replacement duties temporarily into the hands of his young cousin, a man named Theodore who had arrived from London the week before to learn the running of a great house. Theodore was pleasant enough, easily distracted, and entirely unfamiliar with the household's inner workings, which made him precisely the sort of man George needed. "A word, if you have a moment," George said, catching Theodore in the corridor outside the study. Theodore, flattered to be consulted by a man of 11 years' standing, agreed readily. George chose his words with care. He spoke of Flora not as a victim but as a schemer, a housemaid who had, in his telling, engineered the entire incident to secure favor with the Duke. He spoke of glances exchanged, of a young woman who lingered too long in doorways when Desmond passed, of ambitions unbecoming a girl of her station. He said nothing of the bruise on her wrist, nothing of his own hand closing around it, nothing of the 5 words Desmond had spoken that still echoed through the house like a struck bell. Theodore listened, and something in his easily led nature accepted the story as truth. "His Grace ought to know the sort of woman he is protecting," George said, letting the words settle, "before she causes real harm to this household's reputation." He left the conversation satisfied, certain the seed he had planted would take root long after he himself had gone to Dove Bridge. Flora knew nothing of this exchange. She spent those same days in a strange, unfamiliar lightness, moving through her work with a steadiness she had not felt in months. George avoided her entirely now, which suited her fine, and the household, though still buzzing with quiet talk of the confrontation, had largely returned to its ordinary rhythms. She saw Desmond only twice in those 3 days, both times in passing, both times marked by a courtesy he had never shown her before. He inclined his head when she crossed his path in the corridor. He asked briefly whether her wrist had healed. Small things, ordinary things, and yet they settled in her chest like sparks she did not know what to do with. "You are smiling again," Sylvie observed one afternoon, catching Flora over a basin of washing water. "I have not seen you smile in a year." "I am not smiling," Flora said, though she was. "You are, and everyone in this kitchen has noticed, and half of them are wondering what it means." Flora's smile faded into something more careful. "It means nothing, Sylvie. He dismissed a man for cruelty. That is all." Sylvie studied her for a long moment, her expression softening into something that looked almost like worry. "Be careful, Flora. Men like Desmond can afford to be kind because kindness costs them nothing. It is not the same for us." The warning lodged itself somewhere Flora did not want to examine too closely, and she said nothing more on the subject, though the words stayed with her long after Sylvie had gone back to her work. The trouble began the following evening. Desmond returned from the tenant farm exhausted and mud-streaked, his temper already thin from a day spent arguing with a miller over flood damages neither side wished to pay for. He had barely handed his coat to the footman when Theodore intercepted him in the entrance hall, his face arranged into an expression of grave concern. "A moment, cousin," Theodore said. "There is something you should know regarding the housemaid." Desmond's expression sharpened instantly. "What about her?" Theodore, believing himself to be doing his cousin a service, repeated George's carefully constructed story nearly word for word. He spoke of ambition, of calculated glances, of a young woman who had perhaps orchestrated the entire confrontation with Whitmore in order to secure the Duke's protection and, by extension, his favor. Desmond listened in silence, his jaw tightening with every word, though not for the reasons Theodore expected. "Who told you this?" Desmond asked when his cousin finished. "Whitmore, before he left this morning for Dove Bridge." Something cold settled in Desmond's chest. He had trusted his own judgment in that study 3 nights ago, had trusted what he had seen with his own eyes, a man's hand closing around a young woman's wrist hard enough to leave marks. He did not believe, not for a single moment, that Flora had engineered such a thing. And yet the fact that George had gone to such lengths, even as he was leaving the estate for good, told Desmond something far more troubling than any lie the man had spun. George was not finished. Not by half. "Say nothing more of this to anyone," Desmond told his cousin, his voice low and controlled in a way that made Theodore take an involuntary step back. "And in future, do not repeat the words of a dismissed steward as though they carry any weight in this house." Theodore, chastened, nodded quickly and retreated. Desmond stood alone in the entrance hall for a long moment, turning the conversation over in his mind. George had left Brindle House that morning, but he had not left quietly, and a man willing to spread such a story on his way out the door was a man willing to do far worse from a distance, particularly once he settled into a new household with new resources and new ears willing to listen. He found Flora that evening in the small library where she was returning a stack of account books to their shelves, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, entirely unaware of the storm that had passed through the house in her absence. "Flora!" She turned, startled by the urgency in his voice. "Your Grace, I need you to tell me something, and I need you to tell me honestly." He crossed the room, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head to meet his eyes. Did George Whitmore ever suggest, to you or to anyone in this house, that you sought his removal for your own advantage? Flora's face was drained of color.
No.
Never. I said nothing to anyone beyond what happened in truth. I believe you, Desmond said, and the certainty in his voice steadied something in her chest that had begun to shake. But he has already spoken to my cousin, and told a very different story. One designed to make you appear as the architect of his downfall rather than its victim. Flora's hands curled into the fabric of her skirt. Why would he do such a thing, if he has already lost his position? Because losing his position was never the end of it for a man like George Whitmore. Desmond's expression darkened. Men like him do not simply accept a fall from grace. They look for someone to blame, and they make certain that person suffers for it, one way or another. The warning in his words settled over Flora like a shadow crossing the sun. She thought of Sylvie's caution from the day before, of the strange lightness she had allowed herself to feel these past few days, and wondered now whether that lightness had been foolish all along. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. "I will make certain no one in this house gives his lies any weight," Desmond said. "But I cannot promise you what he will do next, once he has settled at Dove Bridge and found a new company willing to listen." He paused, and something in his voice softened, though the warning beneath it did not. "I only ask that you trust me, Flora, when I tell you that whatever comes next, you will not face it alone." She looked up at him, searching his face for the falseness she had learned to expect from men in his position, and found none. Neither of them yet knew that George Whitmore, 3 days into his new post at Dove Bridge, had already begun writing letters of his own, letters meant to reach ears far more dangerous than Theodore's, and that the true danger to Flora had not yet even arrived at Brindle House's door. Dove Bridge sat 2 days' ride from Brindle House, its gray stone walls colder than anything George Whitmore had known in 11 years of service. The Dowager Lady Eugenia Thorncliffe ran her household with a precision that left no room for a man's pride to breathe, and within a week George understood that this posting was no opportunity at all. It was a cage dressed up as a courtesy. He wrote his letters at night, by a single candle, in the narrow room given to men of his rank. Not to the Duke, not to anyone at Brindle House who might carry word back. He wrote instead to a man named Rufus Calder, an old acquaintance from his years in London, who now made his living printing whatever scandal the great houses tried hardest to hide. "A duke of considerable standing has taken an unusual interest in a housemaid under his roof," George wrote. "I dismissed a steward of 11 years' service over the matter. Draw your own conclusions and print what conclusions sell." He sealed the letter and smiled for the first time since leaving Brindle House. At Brindle House itself, the days had settled into something Flora had never known before. Desmond found reasons to seek her out that had nothing to do with ledgers or accounts. Small excuses that fooled no one below stairs and yet went unspoken by everyone who noticed. "You have not asked me for anything since I arrived here," he said one afternoon, finding her in the walled garden where she had gone to cut flowers for the dining hall. "Not a raise in wages, not a lighter position, nothing. I have never had cause to ask, Your Grace. Everyone has a cause, if they think themselves brave enough to voice it." Flora set down her shears and looked at him properly, the late sun catching the edges of the roses behind her. "Then perhaps I have simply never thought myself brave." Something shifted in his face, something that looked almost like sorrow. "That will have to change," he said quietly, "if you are to survive in a house like this one." She did not understand him then, not fully, though the weight of his words followed her through the rest of the afternoon like a shadow she could not shake. That evening, Sylvie caught her in the corridor outside the servants' hall. Her face drawn with worry she had clearly been carrying all day. Una heard something from a carter who came up from the village, Sylvie said, keeping her voice low. A man asking questions about Brindle House. About you, Flora. Flora's stomach turned cold. What sort of questions? Whether the Duke has taken a particular fondness for one of his maids. Whether it is true he threatened to kill a man over her. The words landed like a struck bell, and Flora felt the ground shift beneath her ordinary, careful life. Who would ask such a thing? Nobody knows. But it did not sound like idle village talk, Flora. It sounded like someone was collecting a story to sell. Neither of them spoke Whitmore's name aloud, though both were thinking it. Desmond learned of the same rumor 3 days later, delivered not by a servant but by a letter from his own solicitor in London. A careful, worried man named Mr. Ambrose Selwyn who had spent 20 years managing the family's affairs and had never once written with such urgency. A piece has appeared in one of the London scandal sheets, Selwyn wrote, concerning a duke, unnamed but easily guessed, and a housemaid he is said to protect with unusual devotion. The piece suggests impropriety on both sides. I would advise your grace to consider how such stories, once printed, tend to grow rather than fade. Desmond read the letter twice in his study, his hand tightening around the paper until the edges creased. He thought of George's face the night he had dragged him from that room. He thought of the careful, poisoned words Theodore had repeated without knowing their source. And now this, a printed page in London, circling closer to Flora's name with every passing day. He summoned his cousin that same evening. Did you speak to anyone about what happened here? Desmond asked, standing by the window with his back to the room, the same posture Flora had found him in the night he first asked her to sit. No one, cousin, I swear it. Only what I told you already, from Whitmore. And Whitmore knew everything, Desmond said quietly, more to himself than to Theodore. He knew exactly the shape of the story before he ever left this house. Theodore shifted uncomfortably. Do you believe he is behind the piece in London? I believe a man does not spend 11 years learning the inner workings of a household without learning how to wound it from a distance, once he is no longer welcome inside it. Theodore said nothing further, sensing correctly that his cousin wished to be alone. Desmond stood at the window long after his cousin had gone, watching the last light fade over the gardens where he had found Flora among the roses only days before. He thought of how easily her life could be unmade by a story printed in ink, how a single article could follow her through every household in England for the rest of her days, regardless of whether a single word of it was true. He made his decision before the candles burned low. The next morning, he called for his carriage to be readied for London, and he called for Flora before it arrived. She found him in the study, dressed for travel, his expression graver than she had seen it since the night of George's dismissal. You sent for me, your grace. There is a piece being printed about us, Desmond said, not softening the words, because he had decided somewhere in the night that she deserved the truth plainly, without the comfort of half measures, about a duke and a housemaid, and the danger he threatened over her. Flora's face went pale, the color draining as quickly as it had the day George's hand closed around her wrist. How did they learn of it? I believe Whitmore sent word to someone in London the moment he arrived at Dove Bridge. Desmond crossed the room, stopping close enough that she could see the tension held tight in his jaw. I am going to London this morning to stop it before it spreads further, if it can still be stopped. And if it cannot? He hesitated, and the hesitation frightened her more than any answer could have. Then we will face whatever comes, together. I did not save you from one man's cruelty only to abandon you to another's spite. Flora searched his face, looking for the doubt she expected to find there, the quiet regret of a man realizing the cost of his own kindness. She found instead something steady and unshaken, something that looked impossibly like resolve wrapped around an emotion neither of them had yet spoken aloud. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, though the words felt too small for what she meant. "Desmond," he said quietly, "when we are alone, you may call me Desmond." The offer startled her more than anything else that morning, more than the news of the scandal sheet, more than the sight of his carriage waiting in the drive. No master had ever offered her his name, not truly, not as though it belonged to her as much as to him. She did not use it then. She only nodded, her throat too tight for words, and watched him gather his coat and gloves with the brisk efficiency of a man preparing for battle. He paused at the door, looking back at her one last time. "Whatever Whitmore has set in motion," he said, "he will learn it takes more than a letter to destroy what he could not control while it was still under his own hand." Then he was gone, his boots echoing down the corridor, the front doors opening to the gray morning light beyond. Flora stood alone in the study for a long moment, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart beat too fast for the stillness of the room. Somewhere in London, a piece of paper was already circulating among people who would never know her name and yet would decide, with a stranger's careless certainty, exactly what kind of woman she was. She did not yet know that the scandal sheet was only the beginning, that George Whitmore had planted seeds in more places than London alone, or that the Dowager Lady Thorncliffe, upon reading the very same piece at Dove Bridge, had already begun composing a letter of her own, one addressed not to her nephew, but to a family in the north whose daughter she had long hoped to see married into a dukedom. London greeted Desmond with fog thick enough to blur the lamplight along Pall Mall, and he rode straight through it to the offices of Rufus Calder before he had even stopped at his own townhouse. Calder's premises sat above a print shop on a narrow street, ink-stained and cluttered with proofs awaiting distribution. Calder himself was a thin, quick-eyed man who did not rise when the Duke of Brindle entered his room, though he set down his pen with visible caution. "Your Grace," Calder said, "I confess I did not expect a visit." "You printed a piece concerning my household," Desmond said. "I want to know who supplied it." "A gentleman does not reveal his sources, Your Grace. A gentleman does not print lies about a woman who has done nothing to deserve them either." Desmond's voice remained level, though something in it made Calder's quick eyes flick toward the door, as if measuring the distance to it. "I am not here to threaten you, Calder. I am here to offer you a choice. Print a retraction, or spend the rest of your career discovering how difficult I can make things for a man who trades in other people's ruin." Calder studied him for a long moment, weighing threat against profit the way men of his trade always did. "The piece has already sold well, Your Grace. A retraction now would only draw more attention to it. Then print nothing further. No names, no suggestions, no clever phrases dressed up as discretion." Desmond leaned forward, resting both hands on the edge of Calder's cluttered desk. "And you will tell me who sent you the story." Calder hesitated, then reached for a drawer and withdrew a folded letter, sliding it across without another word. Desmond recognized the hand before he had even unfolded it. George Whitmore's careful, cramped script, the same hand that had once signed a decade of household accounts at Brindle House. He left Calder's office with the letter in his coat and a colder resolve settling over him than he had carried on the ride in. At Brindle House, the household had begun to feel the first tremors of the story's spread. A tradesman delivering flour to the kitchens mentioned, with poorly disguised curiosity, that he had heard talk of the estate in a coffee-house 2 towns over. A letter arrived for the housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, from a former colleague asking, with false innocence, whether it was true the young Duke had lost his head over a servant. Mrs. Pruitt burned the letter without answering it, but she could not burn away the whispers already moving through the house like smoke under a door. Flora bore it as best she could, keeping to her work, keeping her eyes down in the corridors where footmen fell silent as she passed. Only Sylvie remained unchanged toward her, refusing to let the gossip settle into anything crueler than curiosity within the walls of Brindle House itself. "They will forget it in a fortnight," Sylvie said, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "These things always pass." "Not for the woman they are written about," Flora said. "Only for the men who write them." She did not say what frightened her most, that even if Desmond succeeded in silencing the paper, the story had already done what stories always did once spoken aloud. It had made her visible in a way she had never wanted to be, had turned her from a housemaid into a subject, discussed by strangers who would never trouble themselves to learn her name correctly. 2 days after Desmond left for London, a carriage arrived at Brindle House bearing a crest Flora did not recognize, gold and green against dark lacquer, drawn by 4 matched greys that spoke of considerable wealth. Mrs. Pruitt hurried to the entrance hall, smoothing her apron, and returned moments later with instructions for the household to prepare the best guest chambers. "Who has arrived?" Flora asked Sylvie, watching from the kitchen passage as trunks were carried up the front steps. "Lady Thorncliffe," Sylvie said, her voice hushed. "The Duke's aunt. And she has brought a young lady with her, a Miss Honora Redding, from a family up north. Una says it is a match Lady Thorncliffe has been arranging for a year at least." Something cold settled in Flora's chest, though she told herself it was nothing, that a duke's aunt visiting with a marriageable young woman was the most ordinary occurrence in the world for a household such as this one. Lady Eugenia Thorncliffe swept into Brindle House with the bearing of a woman who had never once doubted her own authority. She was tall, silver-haired, sharp-eyed in the manner of women who had spent decades managing households and marriages with equal precision, and she wasted no time settling into the drawing-room as though she already owned it. "Where is my nephew?" she asked Mrs. Pruitt. "In London, my lady. Matters of business." "Matters of scandal, you mean?" Lady Thorncliffe said crisply, and Mrs. Pruitt had no answer to give her. Miss Honora Redding followed her ladyship into the drawing-room with quieter steps, a young woman of perhaps 20, fair-haired and composed, dressed in traveling clothes of obvious quality. She said little, observing the house with careful, curious eyes, and when a maid brought tea, she thanked her with a warmth that surprised Flora when she caught sight of the exchange from the corridor. She is not unkind, Flora thought, and did not know why the observation troubled her as much as it did. That evening, Lady Thorncliffe summoned the housekeeper again, this time with a request that reached Flora within the hour, carried by a nervous under-housemaid who delivered it with visible reluctance. "Her ladyship wishes to see the young woman called Flora," the girl said. "In the drawing-room, directly." Flora's hands went still over the linens she had been folding. She had never been summoned by a member of the family beyond Desmond himself, and something in the request felt less like curiosity and more like inspection. She found Lady Thorncliffe alone when she arrived, Miss Redding having retired to rest after the journey, and the older woman did not invite her to sit. "So," Lady Thorncliffe said, studying Flora with the same sharp attention she likely gave her account books and her marriage arrangements alike, "you are the housemaid my nephew nearly committed murder over." "He committed no murder, my lady. He dismissed a man for cruelty. A fine distinction, though not one London seems inclined to make." Lady Thorncliffe circled her slowly, the way one might circle a horse before purchase. "You are pretty enough, I suppose, in a plain sort of way. I can see how a young man's head might be turned, particularly one as isolated as my nephew has made himself since his father's death." Flora said nothing, uncertain whether any answer would serve her better than silence. "I will speak plainly," Lady Thorncliffe continued. "I have spent a year arranging a match between my nephew and Miss Redding, whose family holds considerable land bordering our own in the north. It is a sensible match, an advantageous one, and it will restore whatever dignity this ridiculous scandal has cost this family. I have never sought to interfere with his Grace's marriage, my lady. Perhaps not intentionally." Lady Thorncliffe's eyes narrowed. "But intention matters little once a story has taken root, Miss Flora. What matters now is what you are willing to do to see it uprooted." Flora's chest tightened. "What would you have me do?" "Leave Brindle House," Lady Thorncliffe said simply, as though the suggestion cost her nothing at all. "Quietly, before my nephew returns from London. A position can be arranged for you elsewhere, somewhere far enough that the story dies for lack of a face to attach it to. It would be the kindest thing you could do for him, and for yourself." The words landed harder than Flora expected, striking at fears she had carried silently since the moment Desmond first called her into his study. She thought of Sylvie's warning about the cost of hope, of the careful, guarded life she had built for herself before a single duke's mercy had cracked it open. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Lady Thorncliffe's expression did not change, though something colder entered it. "Then I imagine we shall discover exactly how much my nephew is willing to sacrifice for a housemaid's pride, and how much this family can survive losing in the process." She did not wait for a response. She turned toward the window, dismissing Flora with the same brisk efficiency she had used to arrange half the marriages in the county, leaving her standing alone in the fading light with a choice pressing down on her that no one at Brindle House could make for her. Outside, unseen by either woman, a rider approached along the drive at a hard pace, mud-streaked and travel-worn, carrying news from London that would arrive at Brindle House only hours before Desmond himself. The rider was one of Desmond's own grooms, sent ahead by his master with instructions to reach Brindle House before nightfall. He delivered his message to Mrs. Pruitt with barely enough breath to speak it clearly. "His Grace returns tomorrow," the groom said, "and he asks that nothing be decided in his absence regarding the household, particularly concerning the maid Flora." Mrs. Pruitt frowned at the strange specificity of the instruction, but she carried it faithfully to Lady Thorncliffe, who received the news with a thin, unreadable smile. "How very like Desmond," Lady Thorncliffe said, "to try governing a house from 2 days' ride away." She said nothing more on the matter that evening, but Flora, informed of the message by an anxious Sylvie, felt something loosen in her chest that had been drawn tight since the moment Lady Thorncliffe had issued her ultimatum in the drawing-room. "You have until tomorrow, then," Sylvie said, helping Flora fold linens in the small room they shared with 2 other maids. "What will you do?" "I do not know," Flora admitted. "Every choice feels like the wrong one." "Leaving would be safer," Sylvie said carefully, though her voice carried no real conviction behind the words. "No scandal follows a woman who is not there to be blamed for it." "And staying?" Sylvie was quiet for a moment. "Staying means trusting that what he feels for you is worth more than what his aunt wants for him." "That is a harder thing to trust, Flora, no matter how much I might wish it were simple." Flora said nothing, because she had no answer that satisfied either of them. That night, unable to sleep, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and slipped down to the walled garden where she had first spoken with Desmond among the roses. The moon hung low and silver over the hedges, and the air carried the last warmth of the day, though her thoughts gave her no such comfort. She did not expect company, and so she startled badly when a voice spoke from the garden bench near the far wall. "Forgive me. I did not mean to frighten you." Miss Honora Redding rose from where she had been sitting, her pale hair loose over her shoulders, a shawl of her own drawn close against the night air. She looked younger without the composed formality she had worn at tea, and something in her expression seemed almost apologetic. "I could not sleep either," Honora said. "This house is very grand, and very unfamiliar, and I find myself thinking too much when I am somewhere unfamiliar." "I should return inside," Flora said, uncertain how to stand before the very woman Lady Thorncliffe had brought to marry the man Flora could no longer pretend indifference toward. "Please, stay a moment." Honora's voice held no command in it, only a plain, quiet request. "I have wanted to speak with you since I arrived, though I did not know how to ask for it without seeming strange." Flora hesitated, then remained where she stood, the moonlight falling between them. "You are the young woman my aunt speaks of," Honora said. "The one the papers have written about." "I am. I confess I expected someone different." Honora studied her with the same careful curiosity Flora had noticed at tea. "My aunt described you as though you were some clever schemer who had trapped a duke through calculation. But you look only frightened and tired and very unhappy to be standing in a garden with me." Flora's throat tightened unexpectedly. "I did not seek any of this, Miss Redding. Not the Duke's notice, not the scandal, not your family's arrangement being threatened because of it." "I believe you." Honora's answer came without hesitation, and something in her plain sincerity eased a fraction of the tension in Flora's chest. "I have known for some months that my match with the Duke was arranged more for the benefit of our two families' lands than for any true regard between us. He has never once looked at me the way I am told he looked at you, the night he threatened a man's life over a bruise on your wrist. You know that. The whole county knows of it, Flora. May I call you Flora?" Flora nodded, too unsettled to object. "I do not wish to marry a man who has already given his heart elsewhere," Honora continued, her voice steady despite the confession it carried. "Whatever my aunt believes she is arranging, I would rather find my own match, even if it costs me her approval. Your aunt seems a difficult woman to defy." "She is." Honora managed a small, tired smile. "But I have watched my whole life how unhappy a marriage built on land and duty alone can become. I do not intend to repeat my parents' mistake simply because it is convenient for everyone but myself." The two women stood together in the quiet garden a moment longer, an understanding passing between them that neither Lady Thorncliffe nor George Whitmore nor any printed scandal sheet could have engineered. "Thank you," Flora said finally, "for telling me this." "Do not thank me yet." Honora's expression sobered. "My aunt will not give up so easily, whatever I wish for myself. She has spent a year building this match, and a year of a woman's determination is not undone by one conversation in a garden." Flora carried those words back to her narrow bed that night, and though sleep came slowly, it came at last with something closer to hope than she had allowed herself in days. Desmond arrived the following afternoon, his carriage rattling up the long drive as storm clouds gathered over the eastern fields, and the household assembled itself in the entrance hall with the particular tension of servants who knew a reckoning was coming and could do nothing but wait for it. He found his aunt in the drawing room, seated with the composure of a woman who believed herself entirely in the right. "Desmond!" Lady Thorncliffe rose to greet him, though her eyes assessed him the way she might assess a horse gone lame. "You look as though London did not treat you kindly." "London treated me as well as could be expected, given the circumstances." He set his hat aside, his gaze steady on her face. "I understand you spoke with Flora in my absence." "I spoke with her about matters that concern this family's future." "Yes." "You threatened her." His voice remained level, though the room seemed to grow colder around the words. "You told her to leave my house quietly, or risk what you called the consequences to this family." Lady Thorncliffe did not deny it. Someone had to speak plainly, since you seemed determined to lose your head entirely over the matter. I have not lost my head, Aunt. I have simply refused to abandon a woman under my protection because her presence proves inconvenient to your ambitions. He crossed the room, his tone hardening. I dismissed George Whitmore for cruelty. I traveled to London to stop a scandal sheet from destroying a young woman's reputation over lies he sold for spite. And I find, upon my return, that my own family attempted to finish what he started. I attempted to protect this family's name, Lady Thorncliffe said sharply. A name you seem all too willing to gamble on a housemaid's account. Her name is Flora, Desmond said, and I will not hear her spoken of as though she were a liability to be managed rather than a woman who has been wronged twice now, once by a steward and once by my own aunt. Silence settled between them, thick and unyielding, until Lady Thorncliffe's composure cracked at last into something closer to genuine frustration. And what of Miss Redding? What of the match I have spent a year arranging? The alliance our families need. I spoke with Honora myself before I left the drawing room, Desmond said, and something in his voice softened slightly. She released me from any obligation the moment I arrived, Aunt. She told me plainly she has no wish to marry a man whose heart already belongs elsewhere, and I believe she said much the same to you, had you cared to listen. Lady Thorncliffe's mouth tightened, though no further argument came, and Desmond understood he had won, not through cruelty or command, but through a truth his aunt could no longer pretend not to see. He found Flora an hour later in the small library, exactly where he had left her the morning he departed for London, and the sight of her steadied something in his chest that had remained unsettled through every mile of the journey home. "You spoke with my aunt," he said. "I did. I am sorry for what she asked of you. It will not happen again, not while I have any say over this house." Flora studied him for a long moment, searching for the words to hold the weight of everything that had happened since the night George's hand closed around her wrist. "And the scandal sheet?" "Silenced, though the story has already traveled further than I would like." He stepped closer, his voice dropping into something quieter, more uncertain than she had ever heard from him. "None of it matters, Flora, not the scandal, not my aunt's ambitions, not George Whitmore's spite, if you are no longer willing to remain in this house." "I have nowhere else I wish to be," she said, and watched something in his face break open with relief he did not try to hide. Neither of them yet knew that George Whitmore, having learned of the scandal sheet's failure and his own dismissal from Dove Bridge that same week, had already begun the long ride back toward Brindle House, carrying with him a final, desperate plan to reclaim everything he believed had been stolen from him. George Whitmore reached the outskirts of Brindle Land 3 days after his dismissal from Dove Bridge, his pride in ruins and his pockets nearly empty. Lady Thorncliffe had turned him out the moment word reached her that his letter to Rufus Calder had been traced back to his own hand, and she had done so without the courtesy of a reference, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a fury that had curdled into something far more dangerous than wounded pride. He did not ride to the front of the house. He came instead through the eastern woods that bordered the estate, on foot under cover of a gathering storm, his mind fixed on a single purpose that had grown clearer with every mile of his humiliation. He would not simply disappear into obscurity. He would make certain the house that had discarded him understood exactly what it had cost him to be discarded. He found the stables first, empty at that hour but for a single stable boy tending the horses, and it took little effort to press the boy into silence with a coin and a threat delivered low enough that no one else would hear it. "Tell no one I was here," George said, "and there will be more where that came from." The boy, frightened and young, said nothing, and George moved on toward the house itself, keeping to the shadows along the garden wall. Inside, The household had gathered for a quieter evening than the estate had known in weeks. Lady Thorncliffe, her scheme unraveled and her pride bruised, had departed that morning for her own estate, taking a subdued but unshaken Honora with her, though not before the young woman had pressed Flora's hand warmly in the entrance hall. "I hope you will both be very happy," Honora had said. "Whatever comes of it, you deserve at least that much after everything." Flora had thanked her, moved by a kindness she had not expected from a woman she had once feared as a rival, and watched the carriage disappear down the drive with something like gratitude settling in her chest. That evening, Desmond had asked Flora to walk with him in the garden after supper, the storm still gathering at the edges of the sky, thunder rolling somewhere far off over the eastern fields. They had said little of consequence on the walk, content instead with a silence that had grown comfortable between them over the past weeks, a silence that no longer needed filling with careful, formal words. "I have been thinking," Desmond said, stopping near the roses where he had first noticed how little fear she carried in her posture, even before either of them understood what that meant. "About what comes next, for both of us." "What do you mean, Your Grace?" "Desmond," he corrected gently, and she allowed herself, for the first time, a small smile at the reminder. "I mean that I do not intend to let the events of these past weeks pass without consequence, not in the way my aunt hoped, but in a way that ensures no one in this household, least of all you, need fear what a man like Whitmore or a scandal sheet in London could still attempt." Before she could answer, a sound reached them from beyond the garden wall, sharp and out of place among the ordinary night noises of the estate. Desmond's head turned toward it instantly, every trace of softness in his expression sharpening into something more alert. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. George Whitmore stepped through the garden gate a moment later, his coat soaked through from the first scattered drops of rain, his face gaunt in a way that spoke of days without proper food or rest. In his hand he held nothing more threatening than an old dueling pistol, inherited from his father years before, though the sight of it in his unsteady grip was threat enough. "George!" Desmond's voice held none of the surprise Flora felt, only a grim recognition, as though some part of him had expected this confrontation since the night he first sent the man away. "You should not be here. I have nowhere else to be," George said, his voice cracking with a bitterness that had clearly festered through every mile of his journey. "You took my position. Your aunt took the only chance I had left to salvage anything from it. And all because of her." He gestured toward Flora with the pistol, and she felt Desmond's arm tighten protectively in front of her, shielding her without a word. "Put the weapon down, George," Desmond said. "Whatever grievance you carry, this will not end it. It will only end you." "You threatened to kill me," George said, his laugh hollow and unsteady. "Do you remember that night, Your Grace? Touch her again and you're dead. Those were your words. I have thought of little else since. I meant every word of it then, and I mean it still." Desmond's voice did not waver, though Flora could feel the tension coiled through his body, ready to move the instant George's grip tightened. "But I would rather you leave this place with your life intact than force me to prove it a second time." For a long moment no one moved. The storm broke fully overhead, rain beginning to fall in earnest, plastering George's thinning hair to his forehead, and something in the sudden cold seemed to break through the fever of his fury. "I only wanted what was mine," George said, quieter now, the pistol trembling in his hand. 11 years, and it was taken from me over a housemaid's bruised wrist." "It was taken from you," Desmond said, "because you laid a hand on someone under my protection, and because you spent every day trying to destroy her further out of spite. That is not a grievance, George. That is the truth you have refused to face." George's face crumpled. the last of his resolve draining out of him along with the rain running down his collar. His arm lowered slowly, the pistol slipping from fingers too exhausted to hold it steady any longer, and it fell into the wet grass between them with a soft, anticlimactic thud. He did not resist when 2 footmen, alerted by the stable boy's frightened confession moments before, arrived to restrain him. He only stood there in the rain, a broken man stripped of everything his pride had once demanded, and allowed himself to be led away without another word. Desmond turned to Flora the instant George was gone, his hands finding her shoulders, checking her over with the same urgent care he had shown the night he first found her wrist bruised beneath George's grip. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, though her voice shook with the aftermath of fear finally allowed to surface. "I am only frightened, and cold, and very glad it is over." "It is over," he said, drawing her close despite the rain soaking through both their clothes. "I promise you, Flora, it is over." George Whitmore was handed over to the local magistrate that same night, charged with trespass and the threatening use of a weapon, and within a fortnight word reached Brindle House that he had been sentenced to transportation, his name struck from every household ledger in the county that had once trusted it. The scandal sheets, deprived of any further fuel for their story, moved on within weeks to some fresher piece of gossip, as scandal sheets always did, and the whispers that had followed Flora through the corridors of Brindle House faded gradually into the ordinary hum of household life. Sylvie found her in the garden one bright morning nearly a month later, the roses in full bloom around them, and could not keep the delight from her voice. "Una says His Grace has been in London again," Sylvie said. "Arranging something with his solicitor. No one will say what. Perhaps it is only business," Flora said, though her heart had already begun to beat faster at the thought. "Perhaps," Sylvie said, grinning in a way that suggested she believed nothing of the sort. Desmond found Flora that same afternoon in the walled garden, exactly where he had first learned how little she feared him, and exactly where he had shielded her from George's pistol weeks before. He carried nothing in his hands, no letter, no ring, only the steady certainty that had carried him through every difficult moment since the night he first spoke 5 words that changed both their lives. "I have spent 5 years believing this house belonged to me alone," he said, "and only these past weeks understanding how empty that belief truly was." "Desmond." Her voice was soft, uncertain, hopeful in a way she had never before allowed herself to be. "I do not offer you a position, Flora, or a place in this household beyond what you already hold." He took her hand, the same wrist George had once bruised, now healed, now held with nothing but gentleness. "I offer you my name, if you will have it, and every protection that name carries, not as your master, but as your husband." Flora looked up at him, at the man who had once been only a distant figure moving through the edges of her careful, guarded life, and found she no longer had any fear left to hide behind. "Yes," she said, "I will have it." Their wedding took place at Brindle House itself that autumn, in the same garden where roses had witnessed every turn of their story, with Sylvie standing beside Flora in a gown finer than any she had ever worn, and Honora Redding, true to her word, arriving with genuine warmth to see the match she had once been meant to make instead given freely to someone else. George Whitmore's name was never spoken at Brindle House again, save as a warning to any steward who came after him about the cost of cruelty within its walls, and Lady Thorncliffe, humbled but not entirely changed, sent a single, grudging letter of congratulations that Desmond kept more for its rarity than its warmth. Flora, once a housemaid who had learned to disappear into corners, became instead the woman every servant at Brindle House looked to with the same quiet trust Desmond himself had shown her the night he first crossed a room to stop a cruelty no one else had dared to interrupt. "What do you think became of George Whitmore after his transportation?" and did he ever find peace with what he lost? Do you believe Lady Thorncliffe ever came to truly accept Flora, or only tolerated her for Desmond's sake? Tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and what you think Flora and Desmond's life together looked like in the years that followed. I will be reading every comment and replying as I can, so share your thoughts, and if you enjoyed this story, please like the video and subscribe for more.